November 25th, 1177, a 16-year-old boy with rotting hands leads 500 knights against 20,000 soldiers. He wins. Completely. It's the most statistically impossible victory in medieval history, and it actually happened, because Baldwin IV, the leper king of Jerusalem, didn't just win a battle at Montgazard. He shattered the core of Saladin's professional army so thoroughly that the Sultan fled on a racing camel through the Sinai desert and watched 90% of his force die of thirst in the sand. You're going to see exactly how 375 Crusader knights annihilated an invasion force 50 times their size. You'll discover why Saladin, one of history's greatest military minds, allowed his army to spread across 20 miles of enemy territory without scouts. You'll meet the Grand Master of the Templars, who convinced a dying teenager to charge directly into the center of an army that outnumbered him 7-1. And by the end, you'll understand why this battle mattered more than any crusade victory before or after, starting with the impossible king himself. If you value documented medieval history like this, subscribe. It's what makes this research possible. Comment where you're watching from. Now, into 1177. The Kingdom of Jerusalem in 1177 was dying. Not metaphorically. Literally dying from the inside. 76 years after the First Crusade captured the city, the Crusader states controlled a narrow strip of coastline from Beirut to Gaza, maybe 12,000 square kilometers. For comparison, that's smaller than the state of Connecticut. The population was around 400,000, but only 30,000 were Frankish Catholics, the ruling class. The rest were Orthodox Christians, Muslims, Jews. The kingdom could field, at absolute maximum mobilization, about 2,000 knights and 12,000 infantry. That's the entire military strength. Total. And it was surrounded. To the north, the county of Tripoli and Principality of Antioch, technically allied but politically fractured. To the east and south, the Ayyubid Sultanate. Saladin had unified Egypt and Syria under his rule by 1174. His military? Professional, battle-hardened, funded by Egyptian grain taxes and Syrian trade routes. He could raise armies of 20 to 30,000 whenever he needed them. The Crusaders were outnumbered, outfunded, and their king was a 16-year-old with leprosy. Baldwin IV was diagnosed at age 9. His tutor, William of Tyre, who later became the kingdom's official historian and our primary source, noticed it first. The boy couldn't feel pain in his right hand. Leprosy doesn't start with visible decay. It starts with nerve death. By 1177, Baldwin had lost sensation in both hands and his face. His right hand was curling into a claw. He couldn't grip a sword. He held the reins with his left hand only, and he was leading armies. Here's the context that makes Montgazard comprehensible. September 1177, Count Philip of Flanders arrived in the Holy Land with a large, well-equipped force from Europe. Fresh troops, experienced commander. Baldwin proposed a joint campaign south into Egypt to strike at Saladin's economic base. Philip refused. He wanted glory in the north, besieging cities in Syria. So he took half the kingdom's available forces and marched to Harim, leaving Jerusalem's southern border exposed. Saladin noticed immediately. November the 18th, 1177, Saladin crossed from Egypt into Crusader territory with 26,000 men, 12,000 elite cavalry, Mamluks and Kurdish horsemen, the core of his military power. 14,000 auxiliary troops and infantry, thousands of camels carrying supplies. This wasn't a raid. This was an invasion designed to capture Jerusalem while the Crusader army was divided. Baldwin had 375 knights available. That's it. Most of the kingdom's forces were in the north with Philip. The Templar and Hospitaller garrisons were scattered across fortresses from Crac des Chevaliers to Gaza. Baldwin moved to intercept Saladin at Gaza with his tiny force. He didn't intercept him. Saladin bypassed Gaza entirely and marched north toward Ramla and Jerusalem. November 22nd, Baldwin retreated into the fortress of Ascalon on the coast. Saladin briefly besieged the city, realized it would take weeks to starve out, and made his fatal decision. He abandoned the siege and continued north, allowing his army to disperse for foraging and looting. This is where the battle becomes possible. 1177 was one of the driest years in a century. We know this from tree ring analysis and sediment cores taken from the Sea of Galilee in 2014. Drought meant Saladin couldn't keep 26,000 men and horses concentrated in one location. They'd exhaust local food and water in days, so he let them spread out across a 20-mile radius. Standard procedure when you believe the enemy is trapped in a fortress and incapable of threatening you. His lead elements were approaching Ramla, 15 miles from Jerusalem. His rear guard was still south, near Ibelin. The army was a stretched column, not a battle formation. November 25th morning, Baldwin and 80 Templar knights under Grand Master Odo de Saint-Amand slipped out of Ascalon and began shadowing Saladin's main body. They marched north along the coastal road, staying out of sight. They picked up additional knights from the garrison at Ebelang. Balian of Ibelin contributed his household force. Total strength now approximately 500 knights and maybe 2,000 infantry, still outnumbered 50 to 1, but Saladin didn't know they were coming. Midday, November 25th. The Crusader scouts located Saladin's main force near a place called Montgisard, identified by William of Tyre as Mons Gisardi, the fortress hill near Tel Gezer. Modern coordinates, 31.86 north, 34.92 east. The Ayyubid army was crossing a ravine at the base of the hill. Archaeological surveys conducted in 2021 confirmed the ravine is narrower than previously thought, about 40 meters wide at the crossing point. The army was strung out, vulnerable. In march formation, not combat deployment. Baldwin called his commanders together. The Bishop of Bethlehem was traveling with the army, carrying the true cross, the most sacred relic in the kingdom, believed to be a fragment of the actual cross of Christ's crucifixion. Baldwin prostrated himself before the relic. William of Tyre, who knew Baldwin personally and likely heard this from eyewitnesses, describes the king praying for victory or death. Then he stood, mounted his horse, probably tied into a high pommel saddle because his legs had limited sensation, and gave the order to charge. 500 knights formed a wedge. The Templars at the front, their white mantles with red crosses visible for miles. Baldwin in the center, the true cross carried beside him. Reynold of Chatillon, one of the most aggressive commanders in the kingdom, on the right wing, they came down the hill at full gallop. The couched lance technique, 10-foot ash poles with steel tips, held rigid under the arm, delivering the combined kinetic energy of horse and rider into a single point. The physics are brutal. A destrier warhorse weighs 600 kilograms. At full gallop, maybe 15 meters per second. Add an armored knight, another 100 kilograms. The impact force of a single charging knight is roughly 10,000 newtons. Multiply that by 500, hitting simultaneously. The Ayyubid center collapsed, instantly. Saladin's elite Mamluk guard, the 1,000-plus professional soldiers who formed his personal protection, tried to form a defensive line. They failed. The Crusader charge punched through them like a spear through cloth. Baha ad-Din ibn Shaddad, Saladin's personal biographer and confidant, admits in his chronicle that the army was dispersed for looting and foraging when the attack occurred. The troops weren't ready. They weren't armored. Many didn't have their horses. The light cavalry that formed the bulk of Saladin's force relied on mobility and archery. In a static melee against heavy cavalry, they had no chance. Saladin himself nearly died. Multiple sources, both Crusader and Ayyubid, confirm he fought in the center of the collapse, trying to rally his guard. He failed. He fled the field on what Baha ad-Din describes as a fast-racing camel, a Dalul bred for speed. He abandoned his army. The Mamluks who stayed to cover his retreat were slaughtered. The Crusader infantry, arriving behind the knights, provided the anvil to the cavalry's hammer. Ayyubid soldiers, trapped in the ravine, couldn't retreat, couldn't maneuver, couldn't fight effectively. It became a massacre. The battle lasted maybe 2 hours of sustained combat. When it ended, the Ayyubid army had ceased to exist as a functional force. Casualty estimates vary, but the most conservative figures from Malcolm Lyon's analysis of Arabic sources suggest 15,000 killed or captured on the field. Another 5,000 died in the retreat, because Saladin didn't retreat to Egypt along the coastal road where water was available. He fled directly south through the Sinai Desert. A rainstorm hit during the retreat, normally a blessing, but in the desert it turned wadis into flash floods. Men drowned, horses collapsed. Most of the survivors died of thirst over the next 10 days. Saladin reached Cairo on December 8th with a fraction of his original force. Baha ad-Din records that the Sultan was so devastated he considered abdicating. The political consequences were immediate. Saladin's reputation as an invincible commander was shattered. His plans to conquer Jerusalem were delayed by a decade. And Baldwin, the dying teenage leper, became a legend. The victory was so improbable that both Crusader and Muslim chroniclers called it a miracle. William of Tyre attributes it to divine intervention. Modern historians attribute it to tactical surprise, terrain advantage, and catastrophic Ayyubid overconfidence. But here's what makes Montgisard matter beyond the immediate military result. Baldwin had maybe 5 years left to live. His leprosy was progressing. By 1183, he'd be blind and unable to walk. But in 1177, he proved the kingdom of Jerusalem could still win. That one desperate charge bought the kingdom another decade of survival. It forced Saladin to rebuild his army from scratch, and it established the template for how a massively outnumbered force could defeat a superior enemy through shock tactics and perfect timing. The question isn't whether 500 knights could beat 20,000 soldiers. They did. The question is how every single element, terrain, weather, logistics, leadership timing, and sheer desperate courage aligned in one afternoon to make the impossible happen, and whether it could ever happen again. The aftermath of Montgisard didn't end on the battlefield. It ended in the desert. And what happened there reveals why this victory mattered more than the numbers suggest. December 1st, 1177. 6 days after the battle, Saladin's retreat column stretched across 40 miles of Sinai wasteland. No organized formation, no supply train, just scattered groups of survivors stumbling south toward Egypt. The coastal road, the logical route with access to water, was abandoned, too exposed, too vulnerable to Crusader pursuit. So Saladin chose the desert, the faster route. The fatal route. Here's what makes the retreat extraordinary. Baha ad-Din ibn Shaddad, Saladin's personal secretary and biographer, traveled with the Sultan during later campaigns and interviewed survivors. His account describes men drinking their own urine by day 3, horses collapsing from dehydration, officers abandoning their troops to save themselves, and then the rain came. December 3rd, a winter storm hit the northern Sinai, normally a blessing in the desert, not this time. The wadis, dry riverbeds that crisscross the region, transformed into flash floods within minutes. Modern hydrological studies of the Sinai, published in a 2018 paper by researchers at Tel Aviv University, confirmed that winter storms in this region produce floods reaching speeds of 15 kilometers per hour, walls of water 3 meters high. No warning, no escape if you're caught in a wadi bed. Baha ad-Din records that entire companies drowned, not in battle, in a desert. Men who survived Montgisard died in flash floods because they were too exhausted to climb to high ground. The Mamluk Guard, the elite 1,000-plus cavalry who formed Saladin's personal protection, was effectively destroyed. Some died at Montgisard, most died in the Sinai. By the time Saladin reached Cairo on December 8th, he had maybe 2,000 men, from an army of 26,000. But here's the detail that changes how we understand the battle's impact. Saladin didn't just lose soldiers, he lost his reputation. In medieval Islamic military culture, a commander's authority rested on victory, consistent, visible victory. Saladin had spent 3 years, from 1174 to 1177, building his image as the leader who would reclaim Jerusalem. He'd unified Egypt and Syria, defeated rival Muslim factions, positioned himself as the inevitable conqueror of the Crusader states. Montgisard shattered that narrative completely. Within weeks, Saladin faced challenges to his authority from emirs in Aleppo and Mosul. His own officers questioned his judgment. A contemporary Arabic chronicle, the Kitab al-Rawdatain by Abu Shama, written in the 13th century, records that Saladin's enemies mocked him as the sultan who fled on a camel. The political damage was worse than the military loss, and Baldwin knew it. The 16-year-old leper understood that Montgisard wasn't just a tactical victory, it was a strategic inflection point. Within a month of the battle, Baldwin launched raids into Syrian territory. Not major campaigns, calculated strikes designed to demonstrate that the Kingdom of Jerusalem was still capable of offensive action, that the Crusader states weren't dying, that Saladin wasn't invincible. The raids worked. By early 1178, Saladin was forced to spend resources rebuilding his army instead of attacking Jerusalem. He had to prove to his emirs that he could still win battles, so he launched a campaign against smaller Crusader fortresses in the north. Incremental victories. Safe victories. Nothing that risked another catastrophic defeat. Here's where the long-term impact becomes visible. Montgisard bought the Kingdom of Jerusalem 10 years. Not through destroying Saladin's ability to raise armies. He could always recruit more troops, through destroying his momentum. In 1177, Saladin was positioned to conquer Jerusalem within 2 years. After Montgisard, he didn't attempt another major invasion until 1187, a full decade later. Why the delay? Because Montgisard proved that the Crusader heavy cavalry charge, when executed with perfect timing and terrain advantage, could annihilate a vastly superior force. Saladin had to develop counter-tactics. He had to train his armies to avoid being caught in march formation. He had to rebuild the Mamluk Guard from scratch. All of that took time, years, and during those years, Baldwin, despite his deteriorating condition, held the kingdom together. By 1183, Baldwin was blind. His hands and feet were completely numb. He couldn't walk, couldn't ride, couldn't hold a weapon. His face was so disfigured that he wore a mask in public, and yet he remained king, remained the symbol of resistance, because Montgisard had made him a legend, the leper who defeated Saladin, the dying boy who saved Jerusalem. Baldwin died in 1185. 2 years later, Saladin launched the campaign that culminated in the Battle of Hattin, July 4th, 1187. This time, Saladin won, decisively. He captured Jerusalem on October 2nd, 1187, exactly 10 years and 10 months after Montgisard. The kingdom Baldwin saved with one desperate charge finally fell. But those 10 years mattered. They allowed the Third Crusade to mobilize. Richard the Lionheart, Philip Augustus of France, Frederick Barbarossa. The massive European response that recaptured the coast and established a new, smaller kingdom of Jerusalem that survived until 1291. Without Montgisard, without that decade of breathing room, the Crusader presence in the Levant might have ended in 1177. That's the real legacy of the battle, not the impossible odds, not the dramatic charge, the 10 years of survival it purchased. And the template it established for how a smaller, technologically superior force could defeat a larger army through shock tactics and perfect execution, a template that military historians study to this day. Because the question isn't whether it could happen. It did happen. The question is whether the specific conditions that made it possible, terrain, weather, logistics, leadership, timing, could ever align that perfectly again. Here's why Montgisard still matters today. Why military academies from West Point to Sandhurst still teach this battle. Why the specific tactical decisions made in 1177 appear in modern doctrine manuals. Because the principles that made the impossible possible haven't changed. Shock, speed, timing, terrain, and the willingness to risk everything on a single moment. The heavy cavalry charge at Montgisard wasn't just medieval brutality, it was physics weaponized. Modern analysis by the Royal Military Academy at Sandhurst, published in a 2019 study on mounted warfare, calculated the exact force multiplication effect. 500 knights charging in formation don't deliver 500 individual impacts. They deliver a concentrated wave of kinetic energy that creates a psychological shock disproportionate to the numbers. The front rank hits, the enemy line buckles. Before they can recover, the second rank hits the same point, then the third. It's not a battle, it's a penetration, a spear through armor. The Ayyubid light cavalry at Montgisard were trained for a different kind of warfare. Maneuver. Harassment. The composite bow from horseback. Their doctrine, documented in Saladin's military manuals preserved in the Cairo Geniza archives, emphasized mobility over mass. Retreat when pressed. Reform. Attack from range. It worked brilliantly against static infantry, against dispersed forces, against enemies who fought predictably. But at Montgisard, they faced an enemy who appeared from nowhere, charged from high ground, and hit with such concentrated force that their entire tactical system collapsed in minutes. Here's the detail that changes everything. The Crusader charge wasn't random, it was calculated. Baldwin and his commanders, Odo de Saint-Amand, Renaud of Châtillon, Balian of Ibelin, studied the terrain before attacking. The ravine at Tel Gezer created a natural bottleneck 40 meters wide. Saladin's army, stretched across 20 miles, had to funnel through that crossing point. The Crusaders didn't charge into an open field against 20,000 men. They charged into a bottleneck against maybe 2,000 men who were in march formation, not battle formation. The rest of Saladin's army was miles away, foraging. By the time they could respond, the center had collapsed. That's the lesson modern militaries extract from Montgisard. Numbers don't matter if you can't deploy them. Saladin had 26,000 men, but at the point of contact, at the moment of decision, he had 2,000, and those 2,000 were crossing a ravine, dismounted, unarmored, surprised. The Crusaders achieved local superiority at the decisive point, 500 armored knights against 2,000 light cavalry in a bottleneck. Suddenly, the odds aren't impossible. They're favorable. The Israeli Defense Forces studied Montgisard extensively during the 1960s and 70s. Declassified planning documents from the 1973 Yom Kippur War show explicit references to the battle. The principle: accept strategic inferiority if you can achieve tactical superiority at the critical moment. Israel in 1973 was surrounded by larger armies: Egypt, Syria, Jordan. The combined Arab forces outnumbered Israeli forces roughly 3-1. But Israeli doctrine emphasized rapid mobilization, interior lines, and concentrated strikes at weak points. Montgisard at scale. The strategy worked. Israel survived. The parallel isn't exact, but the principle is identical. Use speed and concentration to offset numerical disadvantage. But Montgisard teaches a darker lesson too. The lesson Saladin learned in the Sinai. Overconfidence kills. Saladin was one of history's great commanders. He'd unified Egypt and Syria, defeated internal rivals, built a professional army, and at Montgisard, he made a catastrophic error. He assumed Baldwin was trapped. He assumed the Crusader army was divided and incapable of threatening him. He dispersed his forces for foraging without adequate reconnaissance, and he paid for it with 90% of his army. The modern military term is situational awareness failure. Saladin lost track of his enemy. He didn't know Baldwin had escaped Ascalon, didn't know the Crusaders were shadowing his main body, didn't know they were about to charge. In modern warfare, that's what satellites and drones prevent. In 1177, it required scouts. Saladin didn't deploy them. Why? Because he was certain he knew where the enemy was. Certainty is dangerous. Certainty makes you stop checking. And the moment you stop checking is the moment you're vulnerable. After Montgisard, Saladin never made that mistake again. His campaigns from 1178 onward show obsessive attention to reconnaissance, multiple scout screens, advance guards, rear guards, flanking patrols. He never allowed his army to disperse in enemy territory again, never assumed he knew where the Crusaders were. The Battle of Hattin in 1187, Saladin's decisive victory that captured Jerusalem was the opposite of Montgazard. Careful preparation, controlled engagement. The Crusaders were lured into waterless terrain, surrounded and destroyed. Saladin learned from his defeat. That's what made him great. Not that he never lost, that he learned from losing. Baldwin never got that chance. He won at Montgazard and spent the rest of his short life trying to preserve that victory. By 1180, his leprosy had progressed to the point where he couldn't campaign. He appointed regents, tried to manage the kingdom's fractious nobility, watched his body deteriorate while his mind stayed sharp. He died in 1185 at age 24, 8 years after Montgazard, 8 years of slow decay, but those 8 years mattered, because Montgazard bought time for the kingdom to prepare, time for reinforcements to arrive from Europe, time for Saladin to rebuild, and in rebuilding to become cautious. That's the final lesson of Montgazard. Victory doesn't end the war. It buys time to prepare for the next battle, time to make the next impossible decision. Baldwin made his decision on November 25th, 1177. Charge or die. He charged. He won. And the kingdom of Jerusalem survived another decade, not because of divine intervention, not because of miracles, because 500 men on horses hit 2,000 men in a ravine at exactly the right moment, because terrain and timing and desperate courage aligned for 2 hours on a November afternoon, because sometimes the impossible is just barely possible. And barely possible is enough. The men who made Montgazard possible weren't just warriors. They were the military elite of Christendom. Knights who'd spent their entire lives training for one moment, one charge, one chance to prove that skill and steel could overcome impossible odds. And at the center of that elite force stood a military order that would define Crusader warfare for 2 centuries, the Knights Templar. 80 Templars rode with Baldwin that day, led by Odo de Saint-Amand, the Grand Master. Odo was 53 years old in 1177, a veteran of 20 years in the Holy Land. He'd fought at the Battle of Harim in 1164, where the Crusaders were crushed by Nur ad-Din, Saladin's predecessor. He knew what defeat looked like. He knew what happened when cavalry charged without terrain advantage, without surprise, without perfect timing. And at Montgazard, he convinced a 16-year-old dying king to risk everything on a single desperate attack. The Templars weren't just elite, they were professional. The first standing military force in Western Europe since the fall of Rome. Founded in 1119 to protect pilgrims traveling to Jerusalem, by 1177, they'd evolved into something unprecedented, a warrior monastery. Monks who took vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, who also happened to be the most effective heavy cavalry in the medieval world. They trained daily, maintained their equipment to obsessive standards, followed a military rule, the Latin rule of the Templars, that specified everything from how to care for horses to when retreat was permitted, which was almost never. Helen Nicholson's research on the Templars, published in her 2001 monograph, details their tactical doctrine. The Templars fought in formation, always. A wedge of 10 to 20 knights riding knee to knee, lances leveled. The goal wasn't individual glory, it was collective impact, maximum kinetic energy delivered to a single point. At Montgazard, those 80 Templars formed the tip of the spear, the first rank to hit Saladin's Mamluk guard, and they shattered it. But the Templars weren't the only elite force on that field. Reynold of Chatillon commanded the right wing. Reynold was one of the most controversial figures in Crusader history. Brutal, aggressive, absolutely fearless. He'd been captured by Muslim forces in 1160 and spent 16 years in an Aleppo prison, 16 years in chains. When he was finally ransomed in 1176, he returned to the Kingdom of Jerusalem harder, meaner, and more willing to take risks than any other commander. At Montgazard, that aggression was exactly what Baldwin needed. Someone willing to charge into 7-1 odds without hesitation. Balian of Ibelin led the left wing. Balian was the opposite of Reynold, cautious, diplomatic, a skilled administrator who preferred negotiation to battle, but he was also a knight, trained since childhood. And when Baldwin called for volunteers at Ibelin, Balian contributed his entire household force, maybe 50 knights. His personal retainers, men who'd sworn oaths to him, who would follow him into certain death if he asked. And he asked. Here's what makes the Crusader command structure at Montgazard remarkable. These men disagreed on almost everything. Odo believed in aggressive Templar expansion. Reynold wanted to raid deep into Muslim territory. Balian advocated for peace treaties and diplomatic solutions. Under normal circumstances, they could barely stand to be in the same room. But on November 25th, 1177, they functioned as a unified command, because Baldwin, 16 years old, dying of leprosy, held them together through sheer force of will. The Crusader knights at Montgazard weren't just fighting for territory, they were fighting for survival, for their families, for their homes. The Frankish nobility of the Kingdom of Jerusalem were second and third generation settlers. Born in the Levant, they spoke Arabic, ate local food, married into Byzantine and Armenian Christian families. This was their country, not a distant European homeland, and Saladin's invasion threatened to erase everything they'd built over 76 years. That desperation created cohesion. The Templars provided discipline, Raynald provided aggression, Balian provided stability, and Baldwin provided legitimacy, the dying king who refused to surrender, who rode into battle despite hands that couldn't grip a sword, who prostrated himself before the true cross and prayed for victory or death. That image, captured in William of Tyre's chronicle, became the rallying point. Not tactics, not strategy, faith, courage, the willingness to die rather than retreat. The charge itself lasted maybe 10 minutes, 500 knights hitting 2,000 Ayyubid soldiers in a 40-meter bottleneck. The physics were brutal. The front rank of Templars struck first. Lances punched through mail armor and leather. Horses trampled men who fell. The second rank hit before the Mamluks could reform. Then the third, wave after wave of steel and horseflesh. The Ayyubid center didn't just break, it disintegrated. Men fled, threw down weapons, tried to climb out of the ravine, and the Crusader infantry, arriving minutes later, turned retreat into massacre. Saladin's personal guard tried to hold. Baha ad-Din describes them forming a defensive circle around the Sultan, professional soldiers doing their job, buying time for Saladin to escape. They died to a man. Saladin fled on his racing camel. The Sultan who'd unified Egypt and Syria, who'd positioned himself as the reconqueror of Jerusalem, running for his life through enemy territory while his army collapsed behind him. That's the human cost of Montgazard. 15,000 Ayyubid soldiers dead on the field, another 5,000 dead in the Sinai, 20,000 men, most of them conscripts, farmers and tradesmen pressed into service, men who had no choice but to follow their sultan into battle. And they died because Saladin made a mistake, because he dispersed his forces, because he didn't deploy scouts, because he was certain the enemy was trapped and incapable of threatening him. The Crusaders lost fewer than 200 knights. Remarkable, almost impossible. But the victory came at a cost. Many of the survivors were wounded, broken bones from the impact of the charge, cuts from Mamluk swords, exhaustion from 2 hours of sustained combat in full armor, and Baldwin himself, already dying, pushed his body past its limits. William of Tyre records that the king could barely dismount after the battle, that his hands were bleeding, that he had to be carried back to Jerusalem on a litter, but they won. Against impossible odds, against a professional army 50 times their size. They won because every element aligned. Terrain, timing, leadership, courage, and desperation. The knowledge that retreat meant the end of the kingdom, that this was the moment. Charge or die, they charged. And the kingdom of Jerusalem survived another decade. Montgazard didn't just save Jerusalem in 1177, it created a myth. A story so improbable that both sides struggled to explain it. And myths have power. They shape how armies fight, how commanders think, how kingdoms survive when survival seems impossible. Within weeks of the battle, the story spread across Christendom. A teenage leper king, 500 knights, 20,000 invaders annihilated, the true cross carried into battle, divine intervention, miracle. The narrative was perfect, too perfect, which is why historians spent centuries trying to separate fact from legend. And here's what they found. The miracle wasn't divine, it was tactical. Every element that made Montgazard possible can be traced to human decisions. Terrain analysis, timing, reconnaissance, the willingness to exploit a single moment of enemy vulnerability. But the myth mattered more than the facts, because the myth changed behavior. After Montgazard, Crusader commanders believed the impossible was achievable, that faith and courage could overcome numerical disadvantage, that one perfect charge could shatter an empire. And they were right, sometimes. The problem is that Montgazard was unrepeatable. The specific conditions, drought, dispersed enemy, terrain bottleneck, complete surprise, never aligned that perfectly again. But the lesson stuck. Charge, risk everything, trust in shock tactics, and sometimes that worked. At Arsuf in 1191, Richard the Lionheart used the same template. Heavy cavalry charge at the decisive moment. Saladin's army broke, again. But at Hattin in 1187, the Crusaders charged into a trap. No terrain advantage, no surprise, no water. They were surrounded and destroyed. That's the danger of learning from miracles. They teach the wrong lesson. Montgazard worked because every variable aligned. Terrain, weather, logistics, leadership, timing. Remove any single element and the charge fails. But the myth simplified it. Courage wins, faith conquers, charge and God will provide. And that belief killed thousands of Crusaders over the next century. Because God doesn't provide terrain advantages. Commanders do. And Saladin learned that lesson at Montgazard. Never again would he allow his army to be caught dispersed. Never again would he underestimate his enemy. Never again would he assume victory was inevitable. The Battle of Hattin proves it. July 4th, 1187, 10 years after Montgazard, Saladin lured the Crusader army into waterless terrain near the Sea of Galilee. Temperatures above 40 degrees Celsius, no springs, no wells. The Crusaders marched all day in full armor. By evening, they were dying of thirst. Saladin's light cavalry harassed them constantly. Arrows from distance retreat before contact. The Crusaders couldn't close, couldn't charge, couldn't break through. They camped on a hill called the Horns of Hattin. Surrounded, no water, no escape. The next morning, Saladin attacked. The Crusader charge, the same tactic that won at Montgisard, failed. The knights were exhausted, dehydrated, their horses couldn't run. The charge broke apart before reaching Saladin's lines. The Ayyubid cavalry surrounded them, picked them apart. By afternoon, the Crusader army had ceased to exist. King Guy of Jerusalem captured. Reynold of Chatillon executed personally by Saladin. The True Cross captured. Lost. Never recovered. 3 months later, Saladin besieged Jerusalem. October 2nd, 1187. The city surrendered. The kingdom Baldwin saved at Montgisard was gone. But here's the detail that matters. Saladin didn't massacre the population, didn't burn the city. He allowed the Frankish inhabitants to ransom themselves and leave. Balian of Ebelin, who'd fought at Montgisard, who'd led the left wing of that impossible charge, negotiated the surrender, and Saladin honored the terms. Why? Because Montgisard had taught him respect. The Crusaders could still fight, could still win, could still inflict catastrophic defeats if underestimated. Saladin never forgot that. Even in victory, he remained cautious. That caution saved lives. At the siege of Acre during the Third Crusade, 1189 to 1191, Saladin could have stormed the city multiple times, could have overwhelmed the Crusader defenses through sheer numbers. He didn't. He waited. Maneuvered. Avoided direct assaults, because Montgisard had shown him what happened when you assumed victory was certain. You lost 90% of your army in the desert, so Saladin played it safe. And the Crusaders held Acre, recaptured the coast, established a new, smaller kingdom of Jerusalem that survived another century. That's the real legacy of Montgisard, not the impossible victory. The caution it created, the respect it forced, the decade of survival it purchased, and the template it established for how a massively outnumbered force could defeat a superior enemy through perfect execution at the decisive moment. Modern militaries study Montgisard because the principles remain valid. Achieve local superiority at the point of contact. Use terrain to negate numerical advantage. Strike when the enemy is vulnerable, not when they're ready. Time the attack perfectly. Commit everything to the decisive moment. And accept that, if any variable fails, you lose. That's not faith, that's calculation. Cold, brutal, effective. November 25th, 1177. 500 men on horses hit 2,000 men in a ravine and changed history. Not through divine intervention, through terrain analysis, tactical surprise, and the willingness to risk everything on a single desperate charge. Because sometimes the impossible is just barely possible, and barely possible is enough. The men who survived Montgisard carried the memory for the rest of their lives, and those memories shaped how the next generation fought, how they thought about impossible odds, how they understood what courage actually meant. Because Montgisard wasn't just a battle. It was proof that the calculations could be wrong, that the certain could become uncertain in 2 hours on a November afternoon. Reynold of Chatillon survived Montgisard, fought for another decade. At the Battle of Hattin in 1187, he was captured by Saladin's forces, brought before the Sultan in his tent, offered water, which in Islamic custom meant mercy. Reynold refused. Saladin executed him personally, struck him with a sword. The guards finished it. Why? Because Saladin remembered Montgisard, remembered the man who'd led the right wing of that impossible charge, who'd helped destroy 90% of an Ayyubid army. Reynold died because he'd proven 10 years earlier that he was too dangerous to leave alive. Balian of Ebelin survived Montgisard, became the defender of Jerusalem in 1187 when the city was besieged, negotiated the surrender that saved thousands of lives. Saladin allowed him to leave with honor. Why? Because Balian had fought at Montgisard, had led the left wing, had earned respect through that single desperate charge, respect that translated into mercy a decade later. Odo de Saint-Amand survived Montgisard, the Templar Grand Master who'd convinced Baldwin to attack. He was captured at the Battle of Jacob's Ford in 1179, died in a Damascus prison a year later, never ransomed, never released, because Saladin knew what he'd done, knew that Odo had been the tactical mind behind the charge that shattered the Ayyubid invasion. Some victories are too complete to forgive. And Baldwin himself, the 16-year-old leper who rode into battle with hands that couldn't grip a sword, he lived 8 more years. 8 years of documented medical decline that modern pathologists can trace from contemporary accounts. By 1179, 2 years after Montgisard, William of Tyre records that Baldwin's right hand was completely paralyzed. The fingers had curled into a permanent claw, unusable, By 1181, the disease had destroyed the nerves in his feet. He could no longer feel the stirrups, couldn't balance in a saddle without assistance. By 1183, the optic nerves failed. Total blindness, not gradual dimming, complete loss of vision over a period of months. And by 1184, his legs could no longer support his weight. Carried on a litter to review troops. His face so disfigured he wore a silver mask, not for vanity, but because the facial nerve damage had left his features collapsed on one side. Lepromatous leprosy destroys symmetry. The nose cartilage erodes. The eyebrows fall out. Contemporary descriptions suggest his face had become unrecognizable as the boy who charged at Montgisard. But he remained king, remained the symbol, because Montgisard had made him untouchable. The nobility who might have deposed him, who might have declared him unfit to rule, couldn't touch the king who'd saved Jerusalem. The legend protected him when his body couldn't. That's what makes Montgisard's legacy so specific, so measurable. It's not about inspiration, it's about time. The battle bought 10 years, from November 1177 to October 1187. 10 years of survival, 10 years for reinforcements to arrive from Europe, 10 years for castles to be built and fortified, 10 years for a new generation of knights to train. And when Jerusalem finally fell in 1187, the kingdom didn't end. It retreated to the coast, held Acre, Tyre, Tripoli, survived another century because Montgisard had proven survival was possible. The Third Crusade, Richard the Lionheart, Philip Augustus, Frederick Barbarossa, mobilized because Jerusalem fell. But they had something to fight for because the coastal cities held. And those cities held because Montgisard had bought the time to fortify them. The 10 years mattered. Every fortress built, every treaty signed, every knight trained. All of it traced back to 2 hours on November 25th, 1177. Modern military historians study Montgisard in staff colleges from West Point to Sandhurst because the tactical principles remain valid. A 2022 analysis published in the Journal of Military History examined 15 battles from Cannae in 216 BCE to the Six-Day War in 1967, where smaller forces defeated larger armies. The common factors, terrain advantage, tactical surprise, concentrated force at the decisive point, and enemy overconfidence. Montgisard scores perfectly on all four variables. It's the template, the case study that proves the principles work when executed flawlessly. But here's what makes it unrepeatable. Every variable had to align. The drought that forced Saladin to disperse his army, the ravine that created a bottleneck, the march formation that left the Ayyubid center vulnerable, the complete failure of reconnaissance that allowed 500 knights to approach undetected, the timing that put Baldwin's force in position at the exact moment Saladin's army was crossing the ravine. Remove any single element, and the charge fails. The Crusaders are surrounded and destroyed. Baldwin dies at 16. Jerusalem falls in 1177 instead of 1187. The Crusader states end a decade early. That's the real lesson of Montgisard. Not that courage conquers all. That perfect execution of sound tactical principles, combined with enemy error and environmental factors, can overcome impossible odds, sometimes, once. In very specific circumstances that will probably never align exactly that way again. The Israeli military studied it, applied the principles at scale in 1967 and 1973, won both times. But they had air superiority, mechanized armor, and interior lines. Baldwin had 500 horses and a ravine. The principles scaled. The miracle didn't. November 25th, 1177. 500 knights charged 20,000 soldiers. Won completely, killed 15,000 on the field. Watched another 5,000 die in the desert. Broke Saladin's reputation so thoroughly he spent a decade rebuilding. Bought the kingdom of Jerusalem 10 more years of survival. And established a tactical template that military theorists still study 847 years later. Not because it was divine intervention, because every element of terrain, timing, leadership, and enemy error aligned for 2 hours, because barely possible was enough, because sometimes the calculations are wrong, and 500 men on horses can shatter an empire. Once. At Montgisard, on a November afternoon when a dying 16-year-old boy decided that charging into 7-1 odds was preferable to waiting to die in a fortress. He charged, he won, and the kingdom survived another decade. That's not a miracle. That's what happens when impossible becomes inevitable for exactly 2 hours. And 2 hours is enough to change history.